You may be seated. In late October, I ran into a very interesting series of bad luck. As many of you know, I had traveled out to Emerson, Illinois, which wasn't the bad luck. And I was invited to give the opening sermon at the second annual World Student Christian Federation US's conference. That was all quite lovely. When I got back to New York, I dove back into my normal life of school, work, teaching, more school. And then I got sick. Assuming that, with all my safety precautions, I must be imagining things, I set out to get tested, just to be safe, but still planning to head down here to the church for a staff meeting. Well, I never did make it to our staff meeting. Not an hour later, I tested positive for the flu. The flu? I stared at the doctor in shock. The COVID test had come back negative, but the flu had somehow got me. Fine. I did as instructed, drank fluids, hid out in my room for 3 to 5 days, sanitizing every surface so I wouldn't get my roommate Camille sick. A little over a week later, I was back on my feet in the full swing of my normally busy life. School, work, teaching, work, and more school. And then I tested positive for COVID. The text I sent our pastoral team group chat read as follows. I'm on a roll. I just tested positive for COVID and have to quarantine through Wednesday. I should be free to go for everything next weekend, but staying masked. I obviously won't be able to help Kay with the Great Thanksgiving tomorrow. Maybe next month. Sad face. Kay's response came first. You caught me just before I printed the bulletin. Feel better. A pastor's priorities. Lee next. Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry. This is not the kind of role you want to be on, right? Please rest and take care. What Lee didn't realize was this was exactly the kind of role I wanted to be on. Being sick with COVID a week and a half after I had the flu was in fact the only way God could get me to stop much of what I was doing, rest and take care. The sad truth was I actually enjoyed being sick. Being sick gave me the excuse to do what I truly loved, curling up in bed, binge watching television, being alone, sleeping whenever I wanted to, and did I mention being alone? And I was lucky, wasn't I? Neither case was all that bad. I had gotten both vaccines not 2 weeks before I got sick. I was lucky. All but one of my classes last semester were virtual. I wasn't so incapacitated that I couldn't turn in my schoolwork on time. I got out of work at the church thanks to the grace of my employers here. And finding replacements for my shifts at the library was fairly easy as seminarians rushed to my inbox to snatch up the shifts, wishing me well all the while. But the real stroke of luck was a convenient scheduling anomaly at Harlem Clementi. Last semester, Charlene had hired me to be the writing professor for the Harlem Clementi course in the humanities. I taught every Tuesday evening, but that Tuesday I got sick, our own Melanie Baker was already scheduled to take over my class to teach music appreciation. After that, between Halloween and Election Day closures at the community center, I didn't see my students again for about a month. And by that time, I was cleared with a clean bill of health and quite literally didn't miss a beat. So I was lucky, blessed even, and that's where the trouble started. I felt guilty. If I wasn't really incapacitated, if my body hadn't completely shut down, then I can do some work from home, right? Remember how I said I didn't fall behind in any of my classes? Well, I wasn't really incapacitated. My body hadn't completely shut down. So I did the responsible thing and kept up. I told Lee that each time as I started to near the end of my quarantine period, I felt kind of sad. My excuse to do nothing, even if I wasn't fully capitalizing on it, was slipping through my fingers. Soon, I'd have no more good excuses to rest. I wonder how Simon's mother-in-law felt when Jesus took her fever away. Was she relieved? Disappointed? It's uncomfortable to hear about a woman laid up in bed from a fever, and as soon as she is healed, she jumps up to serve grown men. And as a cynic, I wonder about Simon's intentions about bringing Jesus to her. Were he and the boys like, hey, could you take a look at her and speed things up a bit? None of us know how to crack an egg, bake bread. We haven't eaten in days, and the dishes haven't been washed in a week. We are in a dire state. But Simon and the boys aside, it seems that his mother-in-law was tremendously happy to be healed, no matter what lay ahead. During the Bible study on Thursday night, Kay was explaining some of the Hebrew and noted that this term that gets used for the word served was actually the word for ministering. Akama raised that maybe she wasn't serving the men, as in doing chores or waiting on them, but instead ministering to them, testifying to her miraculous experience of God's healing grace. For me, I see a good model either way. Whether she was cleaning and cooking or preaching, her rush to serve is less about a woman's place and about this specific woman's grace. She is a reminder that healing pays communal dividends. When we care for each other, that grace comes back around, and when we feel better, we are better able to go about the work that we care about. Jesus' new band of disciples are clearly an overeager bunch. Mark tells us that, quote, that evening at sunset they brought to him all who were sick or possessed by demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. Jesus spends the night healing all these people. Considering the people God incarnated amidst, the poor, the oppressed, the hungry, the untouchables, it is no surprise that so many of them were sick. In our first class on Tuesday, history professor Dr. Jorge Rodriguez, a fellow Methodist, noted that empire doesn't record the existence or lives it deems unimportant. That's left me thinking how empire also doesn't record how sick it makes those it weighs most heavily on. Last week, Kay preached about the paralytic and his gung-ho friends who break through a roof to get to Jesus. Jesus absolves the disabled man of his sins and then makes a point to the grumblers around him that it's easier to absolve someone of their sins than to remove their disability. At which point, just to show off, Jesus does the latter too. The paralyzed man, for all his suffering and oppression, wanted to be cleansed of his sin just like everyone else, and his friends made sure he didn't miss out. When we look at both of these healing stories from Mark, we get fevers, disabilities, diseases, and demons. And it is important to remember that, as Dr. Rodriguez called it, the people on the underside of empire are not poorly off because they are sinners, though we are all sinners indeed, but they are sick or neglected because of empire's rough treatment of them and lack of recognition of their humanity. We in this community know a thing or two about sickness. In the past few months alone, we have prayed over each other for suffering through surgeries, eye injuries, lost voices, falls, bumps, bruises, physical therapy, cancer treatment, stomach bugs, sports injuries, sinus infections, viruses, and quarantining. This winter, we have been a ragtag bunch. I believe everyone on our pastoral team at one time or other came down with COVID this fall semester. You would think we spent our staff meetings kissing and hugging and coughing all over each other, just passing viruses around like compliments. But whether we consider ourselves the underside of empire or co-conspirators with those who are, Simon's mother-in-law and Jesus both show us that we can only put in the work when we have taken care of ourselves first. Jesus, in fact, parallels Simon's mother-in-law in the gospel passage. After his marathon healing session, with everyone sick from the city at the door, Jesus goes off to be alone. Mark tells us he specifically sought out a, quote, deserted place to pray. While Jesus is tending to some self-care and intentional replenishment, Simon and his companions, quote, hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." One thing the disciples will never fail to do is miss a hint. But this time, Jesus doesn't reprimand them. Instead, he answered, quote, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came to do." Now, I'm not saying I doubted Pastor K, but parallelism would suggest that if Jesus first took care of himself and then went out to proclaim the good news, then yes, indeed, Simon's mother-in-law, after being cared for, probably served by ministering, proclaiming the good news too. And we do love some good literary parallelism. Mark shows us that even Jesus knew he needed to tend to himself before he could tend to others. After working hard to give to the community, he had to give some rest back to himself before launching onto the road to give more of himself to those in need. We are never told in any of the gospel accounts that Jesus gets really awfully sick, but we do see him rest all the time. When he isn't healing or preaching or scolding the disciples or squabbling with disgruntled Torah scholars or receiving water, food, and oil from random women, Jesus is resting. For as much as he is God on earth, he still needs to rest. Without rest, Jesus' ministry would not have been possible, and the message of God would not necessarily have spread all that far. It's refreshing to think that Jesus had his limits like we do. There's this confusing part of the passage Ekema read for us where Jesus prevents the demons from speaking because, quote, they knew him. Between Kay and Ekema on Thursday night, we were having a lot of fun. We learned that this part of Mark's theme may have gone back to this big mystery, this messianic secret, where Jesus doesn't really want just anybody to know who he is and what he is capable of. I think after Simon's mother-in-law did her serving/ministering, Jesus probably had all the advertisement and exposure he could handle. He didn't need dozens of demons flying around babbling about him and his gifts, because even the Son of God has his limits. It's funny how often Jesus runs away from the crowds only for his friends to come hunting him down. Jesus runs away from people when his social battery runs out. He's of no use to anyone if he isn't rested. When we rest, we receive God's grace in new ways, and then we can serve, we can preach, work, rally, protest, create, teach, and support others with more vigor. So now I can say I hope never to get the flu and COVID again, at the very least not back to back, knock on wood. But knowing you all here in this community, this may be big dreaming. But if you never get sick or injured another day in your lives, you will still deserve to rest. God rested on the seventh day. Jesus rested practically every other day. So you and I, mere mortals, definitely have to rest. We will stand a better chance against the empire and have better gifts to give to our community if we give healing grace to ourselves first. We cannot bring about God's kingdom on earth on an empty tank, now can we? No. Amen. Amen.